The morning of March 5th, 1943, Bay of Biscay, 46 degrees north latitude. Captain Lieutenant Heinrich Schroeder stands on the conning tower of U-333, gulping salt air after 8 hours submerged. His watch officer scans the horizon through binoculars. Nothing. The sky's empty, the sea calm. They've surfaced to charge batteries, a routine procedure they've performed hundreds of times. Schroeder lights a cigarette. In his pocket sits a small wooden cross antenna, a device his crew calls the Biscay cross. It's connected to their Metox radar detector below, a French-made receiver that's supposed to warn them when British aircraft are searching with radar. For months, it's kept them alive. When the Metox beeps, they dive. Simple, effective. The device is silent now. At 0915, his radio man shouts up through the hatch, "Aircraft bearing 270 closing fast." Schroeder doesn't understand. The Metox gave no warning, no beeps, no alert, nothing. He screams the order to dive, but it's already too late. The Wellington bomber is directly overhead, lee light, blazing, turning night into day, even though it's morning. Depth charges fall. The pressure hull screams. U-333 survives. Barely, limping back to base with a crew that can't stop asking the same question. Why didn't Metox warn us? If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you're watching from today. Schroeder wasn't alone. All across the Atlantic, in March and April of 1943, German U-boat commanders were experiencing something impossible. Aircraft were finding them on the surface, at night, in fog, in conditions where visual detection should have been impossible. And Metox, the device that had rendered British radar nearly useless for 6 months, was completely silent. This is the story of how German U-boat crews refused to believe in radar technology they couldn't detect, how their confidence in Metox blinded them to a revolution in Allied radar capability, and how that disbelief cost Germany the Battle of the Atlantic, 80% of its U-boat force, and ultimately the war. In August of 1942, German U-boat command made what seemed like a brilliant technological countermove. After months of increasing losses to British aircraft equipped with ASV Mark II radar, they began installing Metox radar warning receivers on every operational U-boat. The device was manufactured by a small French company in occupied Paris, designed by an inventor named Metox Grandin. Its official German designation was FUMB-1, but the crews simply called it Metox. The principle was simple. British ASV Mark II radar operated on a wavelength of 1.5 meters in the 194 megahertz range. Metox was tuned to receive those radar pulses at distances up to 6 miles, far beyond the range at which the aircraft could actually detect the submarine. The U-boat would hear the radar before the radar saw the U-boat. When Metox detected the radar signal, it rendered the pulses as audible beeps in the radio operator's headphones. The crew would then crash dive before the aircraft could close the distance. The antenna itself became iconic among U-boat crews. It consisted of a wooden cross-shaped frame roughly 1 meter across, mounted on the conning tower. The operator would manually rotate it to get a rough bearing on the radar source. It looked like a child's kite. It looked ridiculous. But for 6 months, from August 1942 through January 1943, it worked brilliantly. The statistics were undeniable. Before Metox, RAF Coastal Command aircraft spotted U-boats once every 95 hours of flight time. After Metox became widespread in October 1942, that number jumped to 135 hours. Metox had effectively neutralized British radar. In the Bay of Biscay, the crucial transit area where U-boats had to pass between their French bases and the open Atlantic, U-boat losses dropped dramatically. During August, September, and October 1942, despite constant patrols by RAF Coastal Command, only 1 U-boat per month was lost to air attack in the bay. For the first time since the war began. German submariners felt they had technological parity with the Allies. Better than parity, they had an advantage. The British were using radar, yes, but the Germans could hear the radar coming. They owned the night. Kapitän-Leutnant Wolfgang Luth, one of Germany's most successful U-boat aces, wrote in his patrol report from November 1942, "Metox gives us back the surface. We can recharge batteries, make speed, hunt properly. The British have radar, but we have ears, and ears, it seems, are enough." The confidence was intoxicating. After 2 years of adapting to British innovations, after being hunted by destroyers with improved sonar and aircraft with better depth charges and ships equipped with direction-finding equipment, the Germans finally had an answer. Metox wasn't just a device. It was vindication. It was proof that German engineering could match anything the Allies produced. U-boat Command pushed Metox installation as a top priority. By November 1942, nearly every operational boat carried the system. Training emphasized its use. Commanders who failed to use Metox properly were criticized. The device became as essential as the periscope, as fundamental as the torpedo. But there were problems from the start, small ones that crews dismissed as teething troubles. Metox generated excessive false alarms. It would pick up German Luftwaffe transmitters from coastal bases 80 kilometers away. It couldn't distinguish between actual ASV radar and other radio sources. Operators learned to ignore most of the beeps, to trust their instincts about which signals represented real threats. The antenna itself was fragile. The wooden crossframe broke frequently in heavy seas. Replacement antennas were constantly needed. Some boats cycled through 5 or 6 antennas on a single patrol. The device was primitive, hastily produced, prone to malfunction. But despite its flaws, it worked, or seemed to. What the German crews didn't know, what they couldn't know because the technology was beyond anything they'd encountered, was that while they were installing Metox receivers tuned to detect 1.5-meter wavelengths, the British were already testing an entirely new radar system that operated on a wavelength of 10 centimeters. The cavity magnetron, invented in Britain in February 1940, was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. It was a revolutionary device, a resonant cavity that could generate microwave frequency electromagnetic radiation at power levels suitable for radar. Unlike traditional vacuum tube radar transmitters, which were limited to meter wavelength frequencies, the magnetron could produce centimetric wavelengths, dramatically improving radar resolution and effectiveness. By March 1941, the British had a fully engineered 10-centimeter radar operational on the corvette HMS Orcus. This was Type 2 71 surface search radar, and it could detect submarines with greater range and clarity than any previous system. By May 1942, 236 Allied ships carried centimetric radar, but ships were one thing, aircraft were another. The real game changer would be airborne centimetric radar, and that development moved more slowly, delayed by bureaucratic fighting between RAF Bomber Command and RAF Coastal Command over who got priority for the new technology. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. The British had been developing H2S, a ground mapping radar for bombers that used the cavity magnetron. It operated at 9.1 centimeters in the 3 gigahertz range. H2S used a rotating antenna that created a planned position indicator display showing a map-like view of the ground below the aircraft. Bomber Command wanted every H2S unit for their strategic bombing campaign over Germany. But a radar scientist named Robert Hanbury Brown realized that with minor modifications to the antenna to make it focus forward rather than downward, H2S could be adapted for anti-submarine work. He proposed creating a new ASV radar, ASV Mark III, based on the H2S system. This sparked a furious debate between Bomber and Coastal Commands, with both claiming priority. The debate was resolved by a compromise. Coastal Command would receive a limited number of ASV Mark III units, enough to test the system operationally, but not enough to disrupt bomber production. By December 1942, a handful of Vickers Wellington bombers from No. 172 Squadron were being fitted with the new radar. The first experimental patrol using ASV Mark III flew over the Bay of Biscay on March 1st, 1943. The radar operator on that flight helped the pilot avoid German night fighters, but found no U-boats. On March 17th, a Wellington detected a submarine at 9 miles range. The Lee light failed, and the attack couldn't be pressed. The next night, March 18th, another patrol found a submarine at 7 miles. Then came March 19th, and everything changed. U-563 was transiting the Bay of Biscay, outbound from La Rochelle to its patrol area in the North Atlantic. The commander, Captain Lieutenant Klaus Bargston, was cautious, experienced. He'd survived multiple patrols, knew the dangers of the bay transit. His boat was equipped with Metox, and his radio operator was vigilant, listening constantly for the warning beeps that would signal British radar. At 2200 hours, they surfaced to charge batteries. Standard procedure. The Metox operator reported the receiver was functioning normally, no contacts. The sky was dark, visibility poor, perfect conditions for a safe surface run. Bargston allowed the crew to remain surfaced, running diesels at full power to charge the batteries as quickly as possible. At 22:45, a light blazed from the sky. A Wellington from No. 172 Squadron, equipped with ASV Mark III and a Lee light, had detected U-563 at 6 miles range and closed the distance, undetected. The Lee light turned night into day. Depth charges fell. U-563 crash-dived, but not before the charges detonated close enough to cause severe damage. The boat lost one man overboard, Obermatt Heinrich Hollenborg, who'd been manning the anti-aircraft gun until the last possible second. U-563 survived, returned to base. Bargston filed a detailed report. The Metox had given no warning whatsoever, not a single beep. The aircraft had appeared from nowhere, as if it could see in the dark without using radar at all. 3 days later, U-192 was attacked in similar circumstances. Metox silent, aircraft overhead without warning. 4 days after that, U-638, then U-667, then U-441. Each time, the pattern was the same. No Metox warning. Sudden attacks. Crews who'd trusted their radar detectors were dying because their detectors couldn't detect the new radar. By early April 1943, U-boat command was receiving alarming reports from multiple commanders. The British, they said, had developed some new method of detection, something Metox couldn't hear. The reports were consistent, credible, coming from experienced commanders who'd survived multiple patrols. Rear Admiral Ludwig Stummel, head of the Kriegsmarine's radar department, analyzed the patrol reports carefully. He reached a conclusion that seemed impossible to many of his colleagues. The British, he believed, had developed a radar operating on 10-centimeter wavelengths. German scientists had previously claimed this was technically impossible, that no one could build a radar at such short wavelengths. Stummel was convinced they were wrong, but he needed proof, and proof came on February 2nd, 1943, though it would take weeks for anyone to recognize its significance. That night, a short Sterling bomber carrying an H-2S radar was shot down over Rotterdam in the Netherlands. The aircraft crashed, but crucially, the cavity magnetron survived the impact, relatively intact. German forces recovered the wreckage and, with it, the Rotterdam Gerät, the Rotterdam device. The magnetron was examined at Telefunken's offices in Berlin, starting February 22nd. German engineers confirmed what Stummel had suspected. The British had indeed developed centimetric radar, far more advanced than anything in Germany's arsenal. The implications were staggering. Every U-boat at sea was essentially blind to this new radar. Metox was useless, but here's where the story takes a strange turn. Despite having captured proof of British centimetric radar, despite having the actual magnetron in their hands, this information either didn't reach the Kriegsmarine quickly enough or was dismissed as irrelevant to the U-boat war. Different branches of the German military didn't communicate effectively. The Luftwaffe had the magnetron. The Navy needed to know about it. The connection wasn't made in time. Meanwhile, at sea, U-boat crews were dying. May 1943 would become known in German naval history as Schwarzer Mai, Black May. In 31 days, 43 U-boats were lost. Of these, at least 14 were destroyed by aircraft attacks in circumstances where Metox had failed to provide any warning. The new ASV Mark III radar, now being rapidly deployed across coastal command squadrons, was slaughtering submarines that thought they were safe. The psychological impact on U-boat crews was devastating. For months, they'd trusted Metox completely. When it was silent, they believed they were invisible. They surfaced with confidence, recharged batteries, made speed, hunted aggressively, and then, without warning, death from above. Captain Lieutenant Peter Kretschmer, commanding U-333, wrote in his war diary after surviving an attack, "The aircraft appeared to see us before we could see them, in darkness, in fog. It's impossible to understand how, but Metox gives no warning. We begin to believe they can detect us electronically, even when Metox is silent." Kretschmer was exactly right, but he couldn't prove it, and U-boat command, desperate for answers, was about to make a catastrophic mistake based on false information. On or around July 13th, 1943, a captured RAF officer was interrogated by German intelligence. The British prisoner, whose name isn't recorded in surviving documents, told his interrogators a remarkable story. He claimed that British aircraft weren't using new radar at all. Instead, he said they'd developed a device that could detect the weak electromagnetic emissions produced by the Metox receiver itself, the intermediate frequency oscillator. In Metox, he explained, radiated a faint signal that British aircraft could home in on from as far as 90 miles away. This was technically possible. Superheterodyne receivers like Metox did produce weak electromagnetic radiation from their local oscillators. Detecting such faint signals at long range would be extremely difficult, but it wasn't impossible. The captured officer's story was plausible enough to be believed. German engineers tested Metox receivers and confirmed they did indeed radiate detectable signals. Tests showed the radiation was quite powerful by electronic standards. If the British had developed a sensitive enough receiver, they could, in theory, use Metox emissions to locate U-boats. The irony was crushing. The device meant to save them was betraying them. Metox wasn't just useless against the new radar, it was actively helping the enemy find them. Or so they believed. On August 3rd, 1943, Admiral Karl Dönitz issued an urgent message to all U-boats at sea. All U-boats, attention, all U-boats, shut off Metox at once. Enemy is capable of intercepting. Keep radio silence until further notice. Herbert Werner, executive officer of U-230, described the impact of that message in his post-war memoir. The message had a greater impact on our lives than any since the beginning of the Allied offensive. We trusted Metox completely, and now we were ordered to destroy it, to remove essential components and lock them away. We felt blind, naked. The ocean suddenly seemed full of invisible eyes. Crews followed orders. Commanders physically removed components from their Metox receivers and locked them in safes. Some threw the wooden Biscay cross antennas overboard. The device that had given them confidence for a year was now forbidden, and aircraft continued finding them anyway. Because, of course, the captured British officer's story wasn't true. It was disinformation, either intentionally planted or a lucky accident. British aircraft weren't homing in on Metox emissions. They were using ASV Mark III centimetric radar that Metox simply couldn't detect. Shutting off Metox changed nothing except to make U-boat crews even more paranoid and distrustful of their equipment. The truth about centimetric radar finally became clear to U-boat command in late August or early September 1943, after Stummel's repeated insistence and the analysis of the Rotterdam device. A crash program began to develop a new radar warning receiver designated Naxos FUMB-7, that could detect 10-centimeter wavelengths. But Naxos wouldn't be ready for deployment until late September, and even then, it had severe limitations. Its detection range was only about 5 miles, far shorter than Metox's range. Against the old radar, it couldn't provide bearing information accurately. It was difficult to keep working under operational conditions. By the time Naxos started reaching U-boats in October 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic was already lost. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. In 1942, 11% of Metox-equipped U-boats were sunk. Crews believed this was proof the system worked. In the first 4 months of 1943, before ASV Mark III became widespread, the loss rate was similar. But in May 1943, when centimetric radar began operating at scale, 25% of operational U-boats were destroyed in a single month. From May 1943 onwards, the tonnage war that Dönitz had believed he could win became a slaughter. German U-boat construction ramped up to 20 boats per month, but losses consistently exceeded production. In June, 17 boats lost. July, 37 boats. August, 25 boats. The casualty rate among U-boat crews climbed toward 80%. Young men, fresh from training, would board their first boat, transit through the Bay of Biscay, reach their patrol area, and die. Within weeks, the experienced commanders, the aces who'd survived dozens of patrols during the happy times of 1940 and 41, were being systematically eliminated. When they died, they took their experience, their tactical knowledge, their ability to train the next generation with them. The psychological transformation was complete. In August 1942, U-boat crews had believed Metox made them invisible. They surfaced with confidence, hunted aggressively, took risks because they believed technology protected them. By August 1943, they believed nothing. They distrusted Metox, they distrusted Naxos, they distrusted their own equipment, their own senses, their own commanders. Captain Lieutenant Horst von Schröter, in U-667, wrote a revealing passage in his war diary just weeks before his boat was sunk. "We lost contact with the convoy due to repeated forced dives. Aircraft attacked 7 times in 12 hours. Beginning to believe they can detect us electronically even when all our receivers are silent. But how? We no longer know what's real and what's imagination. Fear becomes its own enemy." Von Schröder was killed in August 1943 when U-667 was sunk by aircraft in the Bay of Biscay. No survivors. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you're watching from today. The Bay of Biscay earned a new name among German submariners in the summer of 1943. They called it the Tal des Todes, the Valley of Death, and the statistics justified the name. Of the 69 U-boats lost in the bay during the entire war, the majority died between March and August 1943, precisely when ASV Mark III radar was being deployed at scale and Metox was proving useless. The geography made it a perfect killing ground. U-boats based at Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, and La Rochelle on the French Atlantic coast had to transit through the bay to reach their operational areas in the North Atlantic. They couldn't avoid it. The bay was roughly 400 miles wide and 300 miles deep. For the first 5 or 6 days of every patrol, boats were confined to this relatively small area. Vulnerable, predictable. RAF Coastal Command's No. 19 Group, flying from bases in Cornwall at the southwestern tip of England, established overlapping patrol zones with code names like musketry, derange, sea slug, and percussion. Long-range aircraft, primarily Vickers Wellingtons, Consolidated Liberators, and short Sunderlands, flew systematic search patterns. Each aircraft, equipped with ASV Mark III, could detect surfaced U-boats at ranges up to 15 miles in calm seas, less in rough weather, but still far beyond visual range. The tactical advantage was overwhelming. German commanders had no idea aircraft were even in the area until the lee light blazed and depth charges were already falling. The boats had perhaps 15 to 20 seconds from initial detection to crash dive. If the aircraft caught them in the middle of a battery charge, with diesels running at full power, the noise covered the sound of approaching engines. Surprise was total. June 1943 saw 2 U-boats sunk in the bay and 7 damaged. July brought 11 boats destroyed and 6 damaged. The first 2 days of August added 4 more kills. These weren't just losses. These were statements. The Allies owned the bay. The Allies owned the night. The Allies owned the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. On August 2nd, 1943, Dönitz was forced to order another tactical change. U-boats were instructed to abandon their attempt to fight back against aircraft with anti-aircraft guns. The brief experiment with flak U-boats, submarines equipped with enhanced anti-aircraft armament and ordered to remain surfaced and fight approaching planes, had failed disastrously. In May, 17 submarine gun battles had resulted in 6 Allied aircraft destroyed, but at the cost of several U-boats sunk and many more damaged. Air Marshal John Slessor, commanding Coastal Command, calculated the exchange rate coldly. A plane costs £60,000 with 10 crew. A submarine costs £200,000 with 50 men. The mathematics favor continued attacks. Instead, Dönitz ordered boats to transit the bay, submerged as much as possible, surfacing only for the absolute minimum time needed to charge batteries, and then only in the hours after midnight, when aircraft patrols were less intensive. When caught on the surface, boats were to crash, dive immediately rather than fight, and they were ordered to hug the Spanish coast, staying as far as possible from British air bases in Cornwall. These defensive measures reduced losses somewhat. From mid-August through the end of 1943, Bay of Biscay losses dropped to roughly 4 to 5 boats per month instead of 10 to 11. But this came at enormous operational cost. Boats that spent most of their bay transit submerged took much longer to reach their patrol areas. Battery life was consumed in transit rather than hunting. Time on station in the operational area was reduced. The entire efficiency of the U-boat campaign degraded. And critically, the new tactics couldn't protect boats in their actual patrol areas. ASV Mark III wasn't limited to the Bay of Biscay. By summer 1943, the Allies had also deployed very long-range Liberator bombers to close the mid-Atlantic air gap, that area of ocean roughly 600 to 800 miles from any land base where aircraft had previously been unable to operate. For years, the air gap had been the U-boat sanctuary. Convoys crossing the Atlantic were protected by surface escorts throughout the journey, but in the middle of the ocean, they had no air cover. Wolf packs could gather, attack, and scatter without fear of aircraft. That sanctuary disappeared between March and June 1943. The VLR Liberators, equipped with ASV Mark III and additional fuel tanks, could patrol the air gap for several hours. More significantly, the Allies introduced escort carriers, small aircraft carriers converted from merchant ship hulls that sailed with the convoys themselves. These baby flat-tops carried a handful of Grumman Wildcat fighters and Grumman Avenger torpedo bombers. The Avengers could be equipped with ASV radar and depth charges. Convoy Owens 5 in late April and early May 1943 demonstrated the new reality. 43 merchant ships, escorted by 16 warships, were attacked by a pack of 30 U-boats. In the old calculus, this should have been a German victory. 30 boats against one convoy should have resulted in catastrophic Allied losses. Instead, 13 merchant ships were sunk, but 6 U-boats were destroyed by escorts and aircraft. The convoy's air cover, provided by a combination of VLR Liberators and escort carrier aircraft, proved decisive. 2 weeks later, convoy SC-130 saw at least 3 U-boats destroyed and 1 damaged. For no merchant ship losses, the U-boats couldn't press home their attacks. Every time they surfaced to maneuver into firing position, aircraft appeared. Every time they gathered for a Wolfpack attack, they were detected and scattered. Captain Lieutenant Herbert Werner the executive officer of U-230, who'd described the psychological impact of losing Metox, survived to write a detailed memoir after the war. He described a patrol in May 1943 that captured the new reality perfectly. "We made contact with a convoy on May 4th. Following standard doctrine, we radioed its position and course to headquarters so other boats could gather. Within hours, we should have had 10 or 12 boats ready to attack, but every time a boat surfaced to close the convoy, aircraft appeared. We were forced to dive 7 times in 14 hours. We never got within torpedo range. The convoy escaped untouched. 2 boats from our group were sunk. We accomplished nothing except to advertise our presence and watch our comrades die." The final count for May 1943 was devastating. 43 U-boats lost, with approximately 2,000 German submariners killed or captured. Allied merchant ship losses dropped to 58 ships, the lowest monthly total in over a year, despite the presence of 240 operational U-boats, the highest number Germany had achieved during the entire war. On May 24, 1943, Dönitz made the hardest decision of his career. He ordered all U-boats to withdraw from the North Atlantic immediately. No exceptions. Boats were to break off attacks, abandon their patrol areas, return to base. The order went out by radio, and commanders at sea received it with mixed emotions. Some felt relief. The constant diving, the relentless aircraft attacks, the knowledge that the next depth charge pattern might be the one that killed them, all of this had worn them down psychologically. The withdrawal meant survival, at least temporarily. Others felt shame. Captain Lieutenant Eric Topp, commanding U-552, one of the most successful aces of the war, received the order while returning from a patrol where he'd sunk nothing, spent most of his time submerged and evading, and watched 2 boats from his wolf pack destroyed. He wrote in his diary, "We are beaten, not by superior courage or skill, but by superior technology and resources. The war at sea is lost." Topp was correct. Though the war itself would continue for 2 more years, U-boats would return to the Atlantic with new technology: schnorkels, retractable breathing tubes that allowed boats to run diesel engines while submerged at periscope depth, started being fitted from late 1943 onward. Acoustic homing torpedoes, the T5 Zaunkönig or Wren, that could home in on the propeller noise of escort ships, entered service in September 1943. And finally, Naxos radar detectors, capable of receiving 10-centimeter wavelengths, began reaching boats in October. But Naxos had severe limitations that the crews quickly discovered. Its range was only about 5 miles against ASV Mark III, compared to Metox's 6-mile range against the old radar. Even worse, Naxos couldn't provide accurate bearing information. The operator could tell that radar was present somewhere nearby, but couldn't determine which direction it was coming from. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Naxos antenna system was also problematic. It used a manually rotated antenna enclosed in a radome, a protective housing that kept out moisture. But in operational conditions, the rotation mechanism frequently jammed. Saltwater corrosion was constant. Even when Naxos worked perfectly, its short range meant aircraft equipped with ASV Mark III detected the U-boat long before Naxos detected the radar. And the Allies weren't standing still. By late 1943, they introduced ASV Mark VI, an improved version of the Mark III with a more powerful 200-kilowatt magnetron that extended detection range. Mark VI also included an attenuator that allowed aircraft to reduce their transmitted power as they approached a target, making it harder for Naxos to detect them and giving the submarine crew the false impression the aircraft wasn't closing the distance. Development also began on ASV Mark VII, operating at 3-centimeter wavelength in the X-band. This would be immune to Naxos detection, just as Mark III had been immune to Metox. The technological race continued, but Germany was always one step behind, reacting to Allied innovations rather than anticipating them. The fundamental problem was that German naval intelligence had consistently underestimated Allied radar development. Before the war, German scientists had made theoretical calculations suggesting that centimetric radar was impractical, perhaps impossible. The cavity magnetron proved those calculations wrong, but German engineers weren't working on equivalent technology. When the Rotterdam device, the captured H2S magnetron, fell into German hands in February 1943, it should have triggered immediate recognition that the Allies had leapfrogged German radar capabilities, but bureaucratic dysfunction meant the information moved slowly between the Luftwaffe, which recovered the device, and the Kriegsmarine, which needed it. By the time U-Boat Command fully understood they were facing 10-centimeter radar, Black May had already happened. Even after Naxos deployment, even with schnorkels and acoustic torpedoes, even with new Type 21 U-boats with streamlined hulls and greater underwater speed entering production in late 1943, the U-boat force never regained the initiative. The statistics from June 1943 onward tell a story of slow annihilation. June, 17 U-boats lost. July, 37. August, 25. September, 9. A brief respite. October, 26. November, 19. December, 8. The monthly totals varied, but the trend was clear. Losses consistently met or exceeded production. The experienced commanders, the ones who'd survived the happy times and knew how to fight effectively, were being systematically killed. Wolfgang Lüth, the ace who'd praised Metox in November 1942, was reassigned to shore duties in late 1943 after becoming one of Germany's most decorated naval officers. He survived the war only to be shot by a German sentry in May 1945, days after Germany's surrender, in a tragic case of mistaken identity at night. Erich Topp also survived by being reassigned to training command. His last operational patrol, in summer 1943, had convinced him the U-boat war was unwinnable. He spent the rest of the war training new crews, knowing most of them would die on their first or second patrol. But most didn't survive. Peter Kretschmer, who'd written about aircraft that seemed to see in the dark, was killed in July 1943 when U-333 was sunk by depth charges from a British frigate. No survivors. Klaus Hartmann, who'd commanded U-441 and survived a hedgehog attack in March, was killed in July when his boat was sunk by depth charges. No survivors. Horst von Schroeter, who'd suspected electronic detection even when all receivers were silent, died in August when U-667 was sunk by aircraft in the Bay of Biscay. 3 survivors from a crew of 48. Otto von Bülow, the commander mentioned at the beginning of this story, was killed in May 1943 when U-404 was destroyed by a hedgehog attack. 49 sailors died, no survivors. Siegfried von Forstner, commanding U-421, survived the war but watched his wolf pack decimated in the March through May period when aircraft with ASV Mark III carved through German formations. Herbert Werner, the executive officer who described the August 3rd Metox shutdown order, survived because U-230 was sunk on its first patrol in May 1943. Before Werner had fully joined the crew, he was reassigned and spent the rest of the war in various training and administrative roles, eventually writing one of the most detailed accounts of U-boat operations from a junior officer's perspective. The human cost extended beyond the men who died at sea. U-boat bases in France became targets for heavy Allied bombing from mid-1942 onward. Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, Brest, and La Rochelle were systematically reduced to rubble. The massive concrete U-boat pens, bunkers with roofs 6 meters thick, survived the bombing. But everything else, the cities around them, the support facilities, the crew quarters, the recreation areas, were destroyed. Returning crews, after weeks or months at sea under constant stress, came back to primitive conditions. No proper rest facilities, no entertainment, no relief from the knowledge that their next patrol would probably be their last. Kriegsmarine doctors began documenting what they called Tiefenneurose, depth neurosis, persistent fear, insomnia, hallucinations, crying out in dreams. Medical Capitan Dr. Karl-Heinz Gerber wrote a report dated August 15th, 1943. 60% of returning crews require psychiatric help. They fear water, cannot sleep without sedatives, cry out in their dreams. The psychological strain of modern anti-submarine warfare exceeds anything we prepared them for. But still the boats went out. Hitler demanded it. The strategic situation required that Britain's supply lines be threatened. Even if the threat was more symbolic than real, there was always the possibility, however slim, that new technology might change the equation again. Dönitz, promoted to commander of the entire German Navy after Grand Admiral Erich Raeder's resignation in January 1943, had no choice but to continue operations. From June 1943 through the end of the war, U-boats sank progressively fewer Allied ships while suffering progressively higher losses themselves. The exchange rate, the fundamental mathematics of the tonnage war, had reversed completely. In 1942, Germany was building 20 U-boats per month while losing 10 or fewer. By late 1943, losses equaled or exceeded production. The Allied shipbuilding capacity, particularly American Liberty ships, had ramped up to the point where replacement tonnage far exceeded losses. In 1942, U-boats needed to sink 700,000 tons per month to have any hope of winning the tonnage war. Once American production reached full capacity, that target jumped to 1.3 million tons per month. It was never achieved after March 1943. The final statistics are brutal. Of approximately 1,162 U-boats constructed during the war, 785 were sunk. Of approximately 40,000 men who served in the U-boat force, roughly 30,000 died, a casualty rate of 75 to 80%, the highest of any military service in any nation during World War II. Most died after May 1943. Most died because the technology they'd been told would protect them, Metox, couldn't detect the technology that killed them, centimetric radar. And when they finally got technology that could detect centimetric radar, Naxos, it was too little, too late, and hampered by limitations that made it far less effective than Metox had been against the old radar. The Bay of Biscay, the Valley of Death, holds many of them still. U-boats lie scattered across the seafloor in water too deep for recovery. Their pressure hulls collapsed, their crews still inside, reduced to bones and rust. Some boats were simply listed as missing, presumed lost. They left port, radioed their position once or twice, then vanished. The ocean took them, and the ocean keeps them. After the war, Allied naval intelligence officers interviewed surviving U-boat commanders. They wanted to understand German tactics, technology, decision-making. The interviews revealed something unexpected. Many commanders had known as early as mid-1943 that the war was lost. They'd known the odds, understood the mathematics, recognized that they were being sent to die for no strategic purpose. When asked why they continued, why they took boats to sea, knowing they probably wouldn't return, the answers varied. Some cited duty, orders, military discipline. Some spoke of loyalty to their crews, a desire to bring their men home safely, even if it meant not pressing attacks. Some mentioned fear of being labeled cowards, of facing court-martial for refusing orders. But some were more honest. They said they continued because they didn't know what else to do. The war was all they knew. The U-boat force was their identity. Stopping meant admitting defeat, admitting that the men who'd already died had died for nothing. So they continued, even knowing it was futile, because the alternative was unthinkable. Captain Lieutenant Herbert Solar, who survived as a staff officer after early patrol experience, wrote in his post-war account, "By late 1943, every commander knew the truth. We spoke it quietly in the officers' mess, never officially, never on record. The Atlantic War was lost. Radar had beaten us. We could hear the old radar with Metox, but we couldn't hear the new radar. And once we couldn't hear it, we couldn't hide from it. That was the whole equation. Technology we couldn't detect killed us." The irony cuts deeper when you understand the specific mistake German intelligence made. The captured British officer who told them that aircraft were homing in on Metox emissions wasn't deliberately spreading disinformation. He genuinely believed it. RAF Coastal Command had experimented with trying to detect radar warning receiver emissions, and some aircrew had been briefed on the concept. The officer who was captured believed his briefing and repeated it under interrogation. German engineers tested the theory and confirmed it was technically possible. So they believed it. And Dönitz, desperate for an explanation for the May losses, grasped at it. The order to shut down Metox on August 3rd seemed logical based on the information available. It was wrong, based on a misunderstanding, but it wasn't stupid. It was the kind of mistake that happens when you're reacting to technological surprise rather than anticipating it. The real failure was earlier, in the fundamental assumptions German scientists made about what was possible. When they calculated that centimetric radar was impractical, they closed their minds to the possibility. When the Rotterdam device literally handed them a working cavity magnetron in February 1943, bureaucratic dysfunction and inter-service rivalry prevented rapid dissemination of that knowledge to the people who needed it most. By the time U-Boat Command fully understood what they were facing, thousands of submariners had already died. The window for adaptation had closed. The Battle of the Atlantic was decided. In April 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, Dönitz ordered the remaining U-boats to cease offensive operations. Some commanders scuttled their boats rather than surrender them. Others sailed to Allied ports under white flags. A few fled to Argentina or other neutral countries. Over 150 boats were scuttled in German ports during the first week of May 1945. 15 in Wilhelmshaven, 10 at Hamburg, 31 in Travemünde, 26 in Kiel, 56 in Flensburg. The U-boat force, which had nearly strangled Britain in 1940 and 1942, which had employed some of the most advanced technology of the early war, which had sent millions of tons of Allied shipping to the bottom, ended in scattered surrenders and scuttlings. The men who'd experienced the happy times, who'd returned to French ports with kill pennants flying and flowers around their necks, who'd believed they were winning the war, most of them were dead, drowned in the Atlantic, killed by depth charges, hedgehogs, torpedoes, or aircraft equipped with radar they couldn't detect. Their war diaries, when they were recovered, told the story of the transition. Early entries from 1940 and 41, full of confidence and success. Entries from late 1942 and early 43, describing Metox installations and expressing renewed confidence. Then entries from March through May 1943, increasingly desperate, describing attacks that came without warning, aircraft that seemed to appear from nowhere, a technological advantage they couldn't counter. The last entries in many war diaries were routine, mundane, a position report, a weather observation, a note about battery charge or fuel state. Then, nothing. The boat never returned. The crew was never found. Just silence, and eventually a notation in German naval records. Missing, presumed lost. The National Maritime Museum in Greenwich preserves fragments of these stories. The diary of Seaman Hans Müller of U-638, found in a waterproof bag after his boat was lost. The final entry, dated May 4th, 1943. The British have a new weapon. Yesterday, U-192 went silent, mid-transmission. Today, U-125 and U-531 vanished. We hear their destroyers, but we cannot escape. They hunt like hounds. Mother, if you read this, know I thought of you. U-638 was sunk the same day Müller wrote those words. 44 crew, 1 survivor. The story of German U-boat crews and radar isn't just about technology. It's about the psychology of technological surprise. It's about the dangerous comfort of believing your equipment makes you safe. It's about the institutional blindness that comes from assuming you know what's possible and what isn't. German submariners in August 1942 genuinely believed Metox had restored parity, maybe even given them an advantage. They weren't stupid. The device worked exactly as designed against ASV Mark II radar. The statistics supported their belief. For 6 months, Metox did exactly what it was supposed to do. But they made the mistake of assuming Allied radar development had stopped. They assumed that because Metox worked today, it would work tomorrow. They assumed the technological race was static rather than dynamic, and when the race suddenly accelerated, when the Allies deployed radar on wavelengths Metox couldn't detect, the German response was fatally slow. Part of this was technical ignorance. German scientists who'd calculated that centimetric radar was impractical had created an institutional blind spot. When evidence appeared that contradicted those calculations, the Rotterdam device, it took months for that evidence to overcome the institutional assumption that the evidence must be wrong. Part of it was bureaucratic. The Luftwaffe recovered the magnetron. The Navy needed to know about it. The information pathway between these services was slow, complicated, and vulnerable to the usual military dysfunction where different branches protect their own interests rather than collaborating effectively. And part of it was psychological. After 2 years of adapting to British innovations, of being on the back foot technologically, Metox felt like vindication. It felt like German engineering had finally caught up, maybe even surpassed, Allied capabilities. That feeling, that psychological comfort, made commanders less vigilant, less suspicious, less likely to question their assumptions. When aircraft started appearing without Metox warnings in March 1943, the initial response was denial, equipment malfunction, operator error. Bad luck. It took weeks of consistent reports from multiple commanders before U-boat command accepted that something fundamental had changed. And even then, they grasped at the wrong explanation, the Metox emissions theory, because it explained the observations without requiring them to accept that Allied radar had made a revolutionary leap. This pattern, technological surprise, followed by delayed recognition, followed by inadequate response, appears repeatedly in military history. Pearl Harbor, the introduction of machine guns in World War I, the fall of France in 1940, radar-guided anti-aircraft missiles in Vietnam. In each case, the surprised party had access to information suggesting the threat existed. In each case, institutional assumptions, bureaucratic dysfunction, or psychological comfort prevented rapid adaptation. For German U-boat crews, the cost of this pattern was nearly total annihilation. 80% casualties, 30,000 men dead out of 40,000 who served, most of them after May 1943. Most of them killed by a technology they'd been told, implicitly or explicitly, that they could detect and evade. The final irony is that German scientists, given time and resources, probably could have developed countermeasures to ASV Mark III. Naxos proved that detecting centimetric radar was possible, just difficult. Better versions of Naxos with longer range and better bearing accuracy were developed late in the war, but never deployed in significant numbers. Enhanced schnorkels that allowed boats to remain submerged for weeks, Type 21 boats with true underwater performance rather than surface ships that could submerge, acoustic decoys to confuse sonar, all of these technologies were under development. Some were even operationally deployed, but they came too late to affect the outcome. The decisive period was March through August 1943, 6 months. During those 6 months, while German U-boat crews still trusted Metox or struggled to understand why it wasn't working, Allied forces equipped with ASV Mark III radar achieved air superiority over the Atlantic. Once that superiority was established, once convoy routes could be protected by continuous air cover, once U-boats couldn't remain surfaced long enough to pursue an attack, the tonnage war was decided. Technology alone didn't win the Battle of the Atlantic. Code breaking, particularly the decryption of Enigma encrypted messages, played a crucial role. High-frequency direction finding, HUFDUF, allowed Allied forces to locate U-boats by their radio transmissions. Improved depth charges, hedgehogs, better sonar on escort ships, all contributed. The sheer industrial capacity of American shipbuilding overwhelmed German sinking capacity, but radar Specifically, the development of centimetric radar that German equipment couldn't detect was the technological breakthrough that tipped the balance decisively, and German crews' inability to believe in, detect, or counter that radar sealed their fate. The Atlantic is a cold ocean, dark at depth, indifferent to human conflict. It holds the wrecks of hundreds of U-boats scattered across thousands of miles of seafloor. Most will never be found. The boats lie in water too deep for recovery. Their pressure hulls collapsed, their crews still inside, reduced to bones and rust. Somewhere in that underwater graveyard lies U-638, lost May 4th, 1943, and U-667, and U-441, and U-404, and dozens of other boats lost in the months when Metox failed and Naxos didn't yet exist, and hundreds more lost in the long, slow dying from June 1943 through May 1945. The men who commanded those boats, who took them to sea during and after May 1943, knew what they were sailing into. They'd read the reports, heard the stories, understood the odds. They knew that the happy times were over, that the Atlantic had become a killing ground, that survival was unlikely. They went anyway. Not because they believed they would win, not because they thought German technology would save them, but because orders were orders, because duty demanded it, because stopping meant admitting defeat, and admitting defeat meant accepting that everyone who'd already died had died for nothing. What they said in their war diaries and letters, in their conversations with each other, in their final radio transmissions, was simple. They were afraid, they were exhausted, they knew they were losing, they wanted to go home, they wanted the war to end, they wanted to survive, but they went to sea anyway, because that's what was required of them, and one by one, the Atlantic took them. The ocean that had been their hunting ground became their grave. The technology that had promised to protect them failed. The mathematics that had promised victory delivered annihilation. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.